like to introduce to you Dr. Gordon Rogers. Gordon is Director of Applied Horticultural Research and Adjunct Professor of Horticultural Crop Physiology at the University of Sydney. He has a PhD, in crop physiology and 24 years, you don't have 24 years experience in agronomy and crop physiology with strong links to industry. Blah, 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 lettuce, melons and baby leaf lime. I left out there. Pick it up and run with it, Gordon.
And thanks to the organisers for inviting me along this evening, and thanks to you all for coming on Friday night to listen to us speaking out here this evening. I'm going to talk to you about some work we're doing for the Australian vegetable industry, and they're interested in renewable energy and this whole area, and they've funded a number of projects out of their grower levies that they pay, and with that money being matched by funding from Horticulture Australia, which is federal government funding. So there's a fair bit of interest in this whole area of renewable energy by the vegetable industry. So I'm going to run through what I might try using this one. So the cost of electricity on farms is a big issue. So they're looking at bills of over $100,000 for large vegetable growers are not uncommon. It's a large amount of money. Retail prices have gone up rapidly in the last few years. The installation costs and the cost of renewables are coming down, as Mark was saying. And we have incentive schemes in place, but we're not sure how long they will continue for. So that's the cost side of things. There's a cost incentive, if you like, for a strong cost incentive for growers to do something about reducing these costs. There's also an environmental imperative as well, and if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by the Australian vegetable industry overall, most of it comes from electricity, which is used for pumping water and running cool rooms. And the rest of it comes from nitrous oxide emissions from soils. And there's a little bit in fertiliser and diesel use on farm. And probably with all of those things, we can do something about those. We can, there's ways to reduce the emissions from electricity. There are ways to reduce the nitrous oxide emissions and so on. So the industry has also funded that work to understand that, and there are things that can be done about reducing those. And if you're interested in that sort of stuff, all that information is on a website called vegetableclimate.com.au. You can have a look there, and it's all there. If we look at on-farm power generation technologies, we've got solar PV is the big one. So we did a project where we worked with energy consultants on a project, and they've looked at this, they've evaluated the types of energy that's suitable, and done 6 case studies on detailed feasibility studies on vegetable farms all around the country. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So they looked at solar, they looked at wind, we looked at natural gas generation using natural gas to run engines essentially. Using LPG for running those engines, using fuel cells, which is sort of like a battery. It's a chemical technology powered by gas. That's not renewable. The natural gas generation is not renewable. It's an alternative. Woody biomass, which is essentially using wood to fuel to boil water and use that to produce electricity. And biogas, which is an interesting one, and that's using taking waste product and using that to produce methane, and then using the methane to run an engine to generate electricity. So that's what we looked at. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those case studies. If we look at solar, so solar, we have abundant sunlight in Australia. There's been recent advances in the efficiency and reductions in the cost. There are question marks over the storage. The battery technology is developing, but at this stage in our study, it's not economically viable yet. And we have subsidies in place to help with that. Solar radiation in Australia, we've got more solar in the north than we have down here, in the southern areas, but still it's enough everywhere really for running solar efficiently. We have a subsidy system in place now. There are two sort of ways this works. For solar, they're called STCs, which are small-scale trading certificates. It's a subsidy based on around installation. So if you get a solar system put on your house or on the farm, they're subsidies that are paid at installation. And they're different zones. You'll be in zone 4 down here. And that's sort of what they are. 3 and 4? 3 and 4, yeah, you're on the border. So that's sort of what they are. They're about, $560 to $660 per kilowatt. So they're significant subsidies. We looked at a case study, we looked at a farm in Western Australia. This is a lettuce farming and processing operation over there. You can see their solar system they have set up. They've got a 100 kilowatt solar system set up. And this is, that's their system. It cost them $190,000 to set it up. After the subsidies were taken off, they're significant. They're a quarter of the cost of that. They're paying, their electricity price is $344 a megawatt. It's like 34 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a pretty high, they're paying a high price. And in Australia, our electricity prices vary a lot around the country. They're not constant at all. So that's the WA high. Their feed-in tariff is zero. That is, if they feed electricity they feed back into the grid, they get nothing for. And their daily demand is like that. It's high during the day and it's low at night. They use it for processing and cooling and so on. So that's their pattern. So we did a feasibility study on that, looked at the economics, because the economics are really, for the growers, are driving this. It's a business and they have to make money. So the economics are critically important. But the economics look good. And I won't go through all the details there with you, but essentially that's the capital cost is dollars per kilowatt hour, per kilowatt of capacity. So they've got a 100 kilowatt system. It's costing them $190,000 to do that. That's up the top there. They got a payback in 5.4 years, or they will get a payback in 5.4 years. All this economics, we're getting an economics. Sorry for giving an economics lesson on a Friday night, but they're getting the value, the net present value is like the current value of the investment. It's a big positive number. Positive is good, so that's a big number. The return on their investment is an annual return of about 20%. So if you think of what you might get for an investment, a bank interest or what sort of investments you might get, a 20% return on that investment is very good. So that's what they're getting for their setup. And the last figure there is their cost of energy. They're paying retail $344 per megawatt, so that's 34 cents a kilowatt hour. They can produce it for $158 a megawatt, or 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's a big reduction, and the whole thing stacks up economically. If you take the subsidies away, it's not as attractive, but it's still positive. They're still getting a return on that investment of 14%. So it's still a positive. It's still a positive thing for them. But the subsidies are quite important, and if they go, it's going to make quite a difference. We looked at another one in the Lockyer Valley in Queensland. This is another system that's set up. This is set up about 8 years ago. It's an older system. It's a sort of a rotating solar PV system. That's the power usage on the farm. It's sort of, they use it for various things. A lot of pumping water. It's a large vegetable area. They use a lot of power. They're paying $100,000 a year for their electricity. The system costs $167,000 and it's only a 30 kilowatt system, and that's expensive by today's standards, but this was put in about 7 or 8 years ago, I think it was, and then it was okay. They're getting a feed-in tariff of 44 cents a kilowatt hour, which is really high, and those just aren't available anymore. But they've got that signed up and that's contracted, and they've got that for 25 years or something. So it works for them, and it makes that system economically viable. So if you look at their figures, they've still got a positive return on investment. It's 10.7%. Their capital cost is really high. That 5,000 figure is a very high figure. But it works for them because of their high feed-in tariffs. And the recommendation to them was actually, in a sort of bizarre way, is to not use any of their electricity that they generate on the farm, to put it all back into the grid and just use all and just use their electricity off the grid because of this high feed-in tariff. So sometimes the economics can have sort of bizarre effects. And the third one is a feasibility study that we looked at in Clyde in Victoria, just near Melbourne, for a large leafy vegetable grower down there. They were looking at putting in the feasibility of putting in a 100 kilowatt system down there. That's their power usage. It's mainly used for processing lettuce and celery and those sort of leafy crops. Their economics analysis look like this, and it all depends on how much you pay. The important criteria for growers commercially is how much they're currently paying for their electricity and what's the capital cost of setting up the system. So it's based on that, really. And essentially it came out that the economics look positive if, provided the subsidies remain, they can get a positive payback and they can get a good return on investment of about 10% or more, depending on how much they pay for their system. So if they get a moderately sort of price system, it's still working out economically. And so that's the go. So they may go ahead, that's sort of their break even. So they may go ahead with that. Payback periods of about 7 to 8 years generally. We looked at 2 other case studies. There's a big chili grower in Bundaberg in Queensland, looked at the same sort of thing. They've done the feasibility. They're going to go ahead with their system. There's another large carrot processor in the Fassifern Valley near Brisbane. Again, did the feasibility. They're going to go ahead with their installation of their system. And we're currently, along with another group that did a range of energy audits on farms, looking at ways of improving energy efficiencies and reducing electricity losses in cool rooms and pumping particularly. We're at the moment going around the country doing a whole lot of workshops in the rural areas specifically for vegetable growers to present the results of these feasibility studies and to talk about the advantages of investing in renewable energy resources. And there's a lot of interest in those workshops. So the economics, it's for the growers, it's partially about the environmental aspects, but it's strongly about the economics. And so it needs to work economically for them to do it. So the question is, how much can they afford to spend on the capital cost of installation? And the key factors there are, the big one is how much they're currently paying for their electricity, and that varies all over the place a lot. So that's a big factor. What are the feed-in tariffs? As Mark was saying, they're now in some cases you're getting rates of about 6 cents a kilowatt hour as a feed-in tariff. Other places like WA, nothing, because the energy generators don't want the power. It's a threat to their system. They don't want it, so they're trying to get rid of it. It's becoming difficult to actually connect, to even feed it in for nothing in some cases. The cost of fuel for gas, the subsidies are important. The capital cost of how much you can get the systems for, the things. So, and the other one is how much of the power can be actually used on site. So that's a really critical one. And some of the farming operations, use power. It's all sort of bumpy. Like they might use it during the day, and then they might not. Particularly if it's a processing factor. There's a lot of on-farm processing going on, as you'd probably be aware. If they're not processing on weekends, what do you do with the power on weekends and that sort of stuff? And if it's got to go back into the grid for nothing or for 6 cents a kilowatt hour, you've invested all this money in the solar system, but the energy you're producing is just going back in and not getting anything for it. So that's an issue. So the economics of solar. So the on-farm thing, produce it for about 12 to 16 cents a kilowatt hour is sort of the range that we looked at. There, the subsidies, the next line there is sort of how much, there's sort of our estimates of capital cost per kilowatt. Depends a bit on the zone you're in. In zone 3, you can do it for about 12 to 13 cents a kilowatt hour. In zone 4, it's a bit higher because the subsidies are less, 15 to 16 cents a kilowatt hour is our analysis. Payback periods of about 5 to 10 years. So, what if the subsidies go, and as Mark was mentioned, the Warburton review of the renewable energy target is recommending that they go. If they do go, in zone 3, the cost of generating electricity on farm would go, we reckon, would go from about 13 to about 19 cents a kilowatt hour. And in zone 4, it would go from about 16 to about 22. So it's quite a big jump, and the subsidies are an important factor in the economics of the whole thing. This is a bit about wind. Wind is all about capacity. It's about the proportion of the time that the wind's blowing strong enough for the wind turbines to be working effectively. There are farms. There are wind turbines in farms in Australia, particularly WA. There's a large carrot producer there that has 10 500 kilowatt generators there that they're operating. In Tasmania, there's quite a few in Tasmania. They're not so widespread in other areas, but there are a whole lot of second-hand reconditioned generators available from Europe that are quite good, they're quite economic, and the prices look quite attractive. So that's where the new ones are less attractive financially. The approvals are quite difficult. There's a long process to go through to get approval. There's opposition to these things, and it's difficult. But they work out quite well. That's something about the wind speed. The subsidies are different here. They also attract subsidies, but they're paid on based on generation. They're paid annually based on how much power is being produced. So, for example, if you've got a 20% capacity, which means your thing's running at 20% of its maximum capacity, you can produce power for about 12 cents a kilowatt hour. If that drops to 10%, your price goes up to about 22. So how windy it is really important. We also looked at gas. Gas is not a renewable, but it's another option for growers, and looked at using natural gas and also LPG to run, essentially just to run generators. And you can use them for producing electricity, or electricity plus heat and or cooling. So we had a look at that. They depend, the economics of those is not so attractive. Using them run on natural gas can be viable if they're connected, if the farm is close enough to the natural gas grid, so that can work. And in that case, at a cost of gas of $10 a kilojoule, you can produce power for about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's like quite attractive. It's pretty attractive in terms of economics, but it's not renewable, and it's not. You have to be connected to the grid. If you look at LPG, the cost of fuel there, it's about $40 a gigajoule, which is, it's pretty high, and that brings the cost of production up to power up to about 32 cents, which is not really economic. So there's some potential there. I just want to finish off with, we also did some work for the vegetable industry on their waste. These are some of some vegetable crops that are funded by the vegetable levy. It doesn't include tomatoes or melons or potatoes, which are big industries, just because of the way the sort of levy system's set up. But there's a lot of waste that's actually produced, and it's about 280,000 tonnes a year of vegetable crops that are grown to maturity and then either not harvested or harvested and not marketed. So they're wasted. It's about a quarter of what's produced is wasted, and it gets ploughed back in or just left or used as stock feed. So the industry was interested in is there something else they could do with that? And one of the things they could do with that is to use it for feeding digesters and to convert that vegetable waste into methane gas and use the methane gas to generate electricity, to run an engine which then powers a generator to produce electricity. And there was a separate feasibility study run by another group that looked at the feasibility of that, and they found that you would need about 25 tonnes of waste, vegetable waste per day, and if you could produce that, then the things are viable. And there's growers, like we had talked to a grower yesterday, he said, he was a potato grower from New South Wales, he said, we'd produce that by morning tea time, they had that amount of waste by morning tea. So they're actually looking at putting in a system like that to produce their own power from waste. And there's all sorts of options about that, like having groups that might work together to pool their waste and use it for that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of interest in that. So the bottom line, we found that solar PV is viable, it can be viable. It depends, at the moment, it depends a fair bit on the subsidies and the conditions and the power that's, the price that growers are paying for power and how much of it they can use on farm, but still, at all the sites we looked at, we found that it could be viable. And most of the sites, as I mentioned, those ones that are actually going to go ahead and put in those sort of systems. Battery storage at this stage wasn't viable on any of the sites, but I think battery technology is improving rapidly and that may change in the near future, but at the moment it's not. Gas, we found, could be viable for, in economic terms, if growers can connect to the natural gas grid. But again, as Mark was saying, the price of gas is rising and who knows what's going to happen to that in the future. And wind is pretty attractive in terms of the cost of production. The turbines are expensive, but once you have them, they're pretty good. They have one of the lowest costs of electricity if you can get them in. It depends on the site and it depends on the issues of getting approval and those sorts of things. So, thank you.